One of the most difficult tasks a creator has is managing expectations. When you establish something over the course of a series, you create the expectation of how things work in that universe. So the people who enjoy your creation keep coming back because they want more of what they expect to get. When something changes so drastically that it doesn't even resemble the original establishment, the people who are expecting more of the same will be disappointed. It's like going to Starbucks and instead of coffee, they've suddenly decided to serve you ice cream with coffee flavor. This is how Gothic 4 ArcaniA decided to treat Gothic fans. It offers something so different from its original games that the fans were left scratching their heads not knowing what this game even is anymore. Before I did my Let's Play of ArcaniA, I had to decide whether I want to treat this like a Gothic game or like a random, unknown RPG, and for the sake of my enjoyment, I decided to go with the latter. To treat this like it wasn't part of a beloved series, but simply an RPG I've never heard of before. Ironically, the game itself doesn't really know what it wants to be or what it wants to be called. If you search for this game, you'll find it under different names such as Gothic 4 ArcaniA, ArcaniA, A Gothic Tale, or simply ArcaniA, as it's simply being called on Steam. Unfortunately, the simple reality is that this game really is Gothic 4, because it continues the story from the Gothic series and the end of Gothic 3 Forsaken Gods. However, this time around it was developed by a different studio called Spellbound, instead of Piranha Bytes like the prequels were. For this review, I wanted to give ArcaniA a fair shot, but no matter how it wants to call itself, it's still Gothic 4, and because of that I will be comparing it to its prequels. And while it does fail monumentally at being a quote-unquote Gothic game, when you take it by itself, it's not a bad game. In fact, it's just okay, and in this review I will explain why. Before we begin, I would like to mention that I will spoil a little bit of the story, and if you haven't played Gothic 1 to 3, then don't watch this video. If you have played everything but not Gothic 3 Forsaken Gods, and you don't know what happens at the end of it, then click on the cards to watch that first. Forsaken Gods itself is a terribly bad game, so I don't blame you if you haven't played it, but the game's ending is canon to the Gothic story, and I will talk about it. I will also talk about the standalone expansion, The Fall of Setarif, because it's also part of the story. Alright, let's talk about the story. At the end of Forsaken Gods, you, as the protagonist, become King Robar III with the support of your companions after assassinating Robar II in Gothic 3. As the sole ruler of Murtana, you decide to unite the warring kingdoms, including Varant, Nordmar, and the southern islands of Argaan, which is where Gothic 4's story takes place. This time around you play as a new protagonist, a shepherd from the island of Feshyr, but as it turns out, you are much more than that, and you're also chosen by the gods to save the world, just like Robar III was. After everybody gets slaughtered on the island of Feshyr by Robar's men, the protagonist sets off to Argaan to take revenge. The main story is interesting enough to keep you moving forward, but in my opinion the highlights were the subplots which each individual area had. Every new place you visit has a new setting and story behind it, and the best part is that you meet up with some of the friends who are more than eager to help you, namely Diego, Gorn, Milten, and Lester. Unfortunately, the story fell flat for me towards the end, and the antagonist didn't seem important at all. In fact, I was impatient to get it over with. Compared to how the final boss climaxed in Gothic 1 and 2, in ArcaniA it felt underwhelming and I didn't get the satisfaction from it. It was just bland. The story felt too dragged out towards the end, with too many convenient obstacles thrown in, which made the whole thing a little bit too tedious to play through. The characters were easily my favorite part of ArcaniA, especially the friends. The game wouldn't have been half as good without them, and it was especially satisfying to see their hero's journey come to an end. Milten was my favorite throughout the series, and I was super happy to see him become a Grandmaster of Magic and a very cool, down-to-earth and modest person. The time spent with Diego, Gorn and Lester was great too, and it led to some very memorable moments. I enjoyed many of the secondary characters as well, and I was glad to see that each of them had unique personalities with interesting problems instead of the generic and bland quest givers in Gothic 3. One of my biggest complaints of Gothic 3 was the fact that most quests felt like fetch quests, copy-pasted across the world, and I wish that each town had some unique story behind it. Well, ArcaniA does just that, and it is, in my opinion, one of its biggest strengths. I was very excited to go from one area to another and to meet new characters and see what sort of interesting story they have to tell. Which leads me to the exploration in-game. One of the biggest selling points of the prequels were the rich open worlds that were up to you to explore at your own pace. ArcaniA is also tagged as an open world by Steam at least, but to me it didn't feel like an open world at all, and I have a bag of mixed feelings about it. To me, an open world is something that you are free to explore from the very start of the game, or at least after the prologue. You can go from one corner to the other with nothing hard stopping you from exploring. ArcaniA didn't have an open world but a segmented world, with each segment only being just difficult enough to give you a challenge, but never too difficult that you'd ever have to turn back. Even on the highest difficulty, the enemies were easily dispatched, so I never had a problem exploring the entire segments as I progressed through them. In contrast to something like Gothic 2, where you could encounter some of the hardest enemies in the game from the very beginning, such as snappers or orcs, so you had to use your common sense and turn back, only to return when you are stronger. This is, in my opinion, one of the biggest faults with the way Spellbound designed their world. On the one hand, yes, I enjoyed the areas and they were diverse and interesting, but I didn't care about them, not in the way I cared about exploration in Gothic 1 to 3. Having to revisit areas which I previously deemed too difficult at my own discretion made it feel personal and familiar, which in turn made me fall in love with the world. In ArcaniA, not only that you don't have a reason to revisit an area, but it is too difficult as well. With the teleporter circles being next to useless and no sprinting function, it takes too long to get around, let alone go back and revisit. In Gothic 2, the world suffered changes as the story progressed. It had an element of nostalgia going back to the early zones. And this is something that was constantly in the back of my mind when playing through ArcaniA. I craved for a reason to go back and revisit, to talk to some of the cool people I've met along the way, but the game was constantly pushing me forward with linear story and segmented world. Linked to the exploration is the combat, which suffered from the exact same problem. Enemies never felt too strong or too weak, they were the same from start to finish. I don't mind that the combat was done completely different from the prequels, more akin to a Dark Souls game with attack patterns and rolls, but I didn't like that no fight was particularly impactful. The game played the same way from start to finish. As a mage, all I had to do is throw a fireball, roll away, throw another fireball, roll away again. Once I upgraded my fireball to the maximum, the game was over. It only required one spell and rolling to beat it. The fact is, it was boring. No matter how much I want to spin it and talk about characters, story, etc., this game was unfortunately boring to play, even on the highest difficulty. It felt like a pointless grind, with some of the dungeons being too long and tedious, and you really start to notice how boring the game is when you go through the most uninspired dungeons with some of the enemies doing the same moves over and over again. Gothic 3 was the worst in a series when it came to story, characters, atmosphere and so on, but the combat and exploration were fucking good and it was fun to play, which is why I still replay it. ArcaniA is boring to play. It has 3 spells, which upgrade, sure, but it has 3 goddamn spells. Gothic 3 had over 50, and sure they're not all S tier, but at least there's diversity and build diversity, and most importantly, they combo together. In ArcaniA, you have 3 spells which don't combo together. It's ridiculously boring. The gameplay feels too arcadey, too streamlined. You learn spells on the go, you craft items on the go. Oh, you need a sword crafted? No problem, you can make it in an open field while fighting some goblin, because why not? Taking the time to go to a smithy was 2006. In 2010, you make shit on the fly, nobody has time. Ridiculous game design. You can even turn off from the options menu immersion activities such as sleeping and farting. This game gives exactly 0 learning points about immersion. The music and sound design is bland and uninspired. In fact, I barely noticed them, and it wasn't because how well they blended in, but because of how washed out and uninteresting they were. Nothing else is really worth mentioning anymore, because at the end of the day, if the gameplay in a video game is boring, what else matters? Everything else crumbles around it. Even though it was a bit exciting at the start, the game became awfully boring towards the end because it was just the same, no variety, no spice, nothing, just roll and shoot. At least the boss fights are pretty interesting in both ArcaniA and Fall of Setarif, so at least there's that. But before you get to them, you already hate the game for making you jump through dozens of meaningless, uncreative hoops. So let's talk a little bit about Fall of Setarif, the standalone expansion. Surprisingly, even though it was very short, it did a couple of things which I enjoyed. Firstly, you could actually import your character from ArcaniA, allowing you to continue where you left off. This was super good, especially after having played Forsaken Gods, where you had to restart from 0 for no goddamn reason. Secondly, you spend more time with the friends, which again was the best part of the game. And as a bonus, you get to play as Gorn and Lester, which was a nice change of pace. You also get to kick Thoris's butt for the nth time. Ugh, this guy is a cockroach. And some of the other characters were interesting as well. And lastly, there was a very cool story reveal about the gods, which I won't spoil, but I enjoyed very much. So that's about it. It was short and sweet, and much better than how Forsaken Gods was handled. Unfortunately, it suffers from the same issues as the main game. I like the fact that it makes fun of hair at some point, because seriously, the way some characters' hair and facial animations look like in both ArcaniA and the expansion is totally weird and cringe-worthy. I think it would have been better if the camera didn't point at their faces at all. There are situations where the protagonist and Zyra look almost bald. It also didn't help that many of the character models were copy-pasted to multiple NPCs. And there were situations where the ambient dialogue was used way too often, making for some really good memes. With Voltus. Here? A stranger here?
Are you real? Am I real?
No, nobody's real. You're on Swampweed. I'm with Voltus and researching new magic. So, yeah. Here?
A stranger. Here?
Here?
A stranger.
Here? All in all, if it weren't so repetitive, Gothic 4 ArcaniA could have even been a decent game. but as it stands is just an average and pretty boring game. It's okay to play through at least one time if you're a fan of the series, but beyond that, it has very little replay value. Let me know in the comments section below what you guys thought of ArcaniA and if you consider it part of the Gothic series. And also, what class did you play it as? Thank you for watching and have a nice day.